On the morning of March 17, 1993, the Highland Park Casino in Detroit, Michigan discovered that $3.4 million had vanished from their counting room vault. What made this particular heist remarkable wasn't just the staggering amount or the precision of the theft, but what happened afterward. The man responsible, Darnell Pierce, didn't flee to Mexico or the Caribbean like most thieves dream of doing. He didn't buy a mansion or a sports car. Instead, he put on a maintenance uniform and became a janitor at a community college in Flint, Michigan, 47 miles north of Detroit. For 13 years, he mopped floors, emptied trash cans, and cleaned bathrooms while living in a modest apartment that barely had heat in the winter. Pierce arrived at work every morning at 5 a.m., clocked in with perfect punctuality, and went about his duties with an almost obsessive dedication to being unremarkable. His co-workers described him as quiet, reliable, and forgettable. He ate lunch alone, never went to happy hours, and politely declined all invitations to socialize beyond the workplace. He drove a 15-year-old Honda Civic with rust eating through the fenders and wore the same rotation of 3 threadbare jackets throughout the Michigan winters. But on November 3, 2006, during a routine inspection of the college's maintenance department storage rooms, a supervisor named Patricia Wilkins made a discovery that would rewrite the history of one of Detroit's most baffling unsolved heists. Inside a commercial-grade mop bucket that Pierce had been using for over a decade, beneath a false bottom that had been expertly welded into place, investigators would eventually find $2.8 million in cash, meticulously wrapped in vacuum-sealed bags to protect it from moisture and decay. The mop itself, a heavy-duty industrial cleaning tool that Pierce wheeled around campus daily, contained another $400,000 distributed throughout its hollow aluminum handle. Darnell Pierce had spent 13 years hiding in the most visible place possible, pushing millions of dollars around a college campus while dressed as the help. A man so ordinary that students and faculty walked past him thousands of times without truly seeing him at all. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Darnell Pierce grew up in the Brightmoor neighborhood of Detroit during the 1970s and 80s. A time when the auto industry's collapse was turning entire city blocks into urban wastelands. His mother worked double shifts at a dry cleaner on Grand River Avenue, and his father had left before Darnell's 3rd birthday. By the time he was 14, Darnell was working under-the-table jobs to help with rent, developing a work ethic that his mother praised, but that grew from necessity rather than ambition. He was intelligent, scoring well enough on standardized tests to earn admission to Wayne State University, but money remained the obstacle it had always been. Instead of college, Pierce found work in the service industry, bouncing between hotels, office buildings, and eventually casinos as they began sprouting up in Detroit during the early 90s. He had a knack for understanding systems, for seeing how things worked. While other maintenance workers complained about broken equipment or inefficient procedures, Pierce studied them, learning the mechanical and organizational infrastructure of every building he worked in. In January of 1991, Pierce was hired by the Highland Park Casino as part of their environmental services team. The casino had opened just 8 months earlier, riding the wave of gambling expansion that promised to revitalize Detroit's economy. The Highland Park was smaller than the major casinos that would later dominate downtown, but it was profitable, pulling in money from locals and suburban visitors who didn't want to drive all the way to Windsor. Ontario Pierce worked the overnight shift, arriving at midnight and leaving at 8 a.m. His responsibilities included cleaning the gaming floors, maintaining the restrooms, and servicing the administrative areas where casino management conducted business, far from the bells and flashing lights. It was in these back hallways, during the dead hours between 3 and 5 in the morning, when even the most dedicated gamblers had stumbled home, that Pierce began to understand the casino's vulnerabilities. The counting room was located on the 2nd floor, accessed through a service corridor that Pierce cleaned 3 times per week. He noticed the patterns. The money was transported to the vault every night at 2:15 a.m. by two security guards who had been doing the same route for so long they'd become complacent. The vault itself had a time lock mechanism that opened at 6 a.m. for the day shift accounting team. But there was a 15-minute window every Tuesday and Friday morning when a supervisor named Gerald Hutchins came in early to prepare reports for the weekend cash pickups by the armored car service. Hutchins was predictable, arriving at exactly 5:45 a.m., always stopping first at the break room for coffee, giving himself that brief caffeine boost before diving into spreadsheets. The vault had to be manually locked after Hutchins finished his work, a procedure that should have been automatic, but had been compromised by a malfunction in the electronic system 3 months earlier. The casino had been waiting for a specialized repair technician, and in the meantime, they'd implemented a manual protocol that required Hutchins to physically spin the dial and verify the lock. Pierce watched these patterns for 16 months. He noticed that the security cameras in the service corridor had blind spots near the elevator shaft. He observed that the maintenance staff had access to supply closets with passkeys that could open most non-vault doors in the building. He learned that the trash compactor room shared a ventilation duct with the counting room. Most importantly, he recognized that Hutchins had a habit of leaving the vault door slightly ajar while he worked, propping it open with a rubber doorstop, because the vault's ventilation system was inadequate, and he complained about feeling claustrophobic. The plan that Pierce developed was simple in its brilliance. He wouldn't try to crack the vault or disable alarms. He would walk through the door when it was already open. On the night of March 16th, 1993, Pierce arrived at work as usual. He went through his regular cleaning routine, making sure to be seen by security guards and other staff members. At 4:30 a.m., he entered the supply closet on the second floor and changed out of his regular maintenance uniform into an identical one he'd purchased and kept hidden in a garbage bag behind boxes of industrial cleaner. The switch was crucial. It meant his actual work uniform would be accounted for, clocked in and out, while this duplicate would never appear on any inventory. He waited in that supply closet until 5:43 a.m., listening through the door for the distinct sound of Hutchins' footsteps in the corridor. When he heard the supervisor pass by, heading toward the break room for his ritual coffee, Pierce emerged and moved quickly to the counting room entrance. The door was locked, but the adjacent storage room wasn't. This storage room, which Pierce had deliberately left understocked over the previous weeks during his regular duties, contained backup supplies and also shared the same alarm circuit as the counting room due to a cost-saving decision during the casino's construction. Pierce had studied the alarm system's manual, which he'd found carelessly left in the security office during one of his cleaning shifts. He knew that disabling the motion sensors in the storage room would trigger a false alert at the security desk, but it would register as a routine malfunction rather than an intrusion. He'd seen it happen twice before during his time at the casino. Maintenance issues that security logged and then forgot about. Using a small screwdriver, Pierce opened the alarm panel in the storage room and disconnected a single wire. Downstairs at the security desk, a yellow light flickered on a monitor. The overnight guard, a man named Thomas Riley, who was more interested in his portable television than the board of indicator lights, glanced at it, noted the sector code, and wrote Storage 2F sensor glitch in the logbook. It was 5:51 a.m. Pierce moved through the storage room to its connecting door with the counting room. This door was rarely used, existing mainly for emergency access. The lock was basic, a standard commercial deadbolt that Pierce had studied extensively. Using a bump key he'd filed from a blank purchased at a hardware store in Warren, Michigan weeks earlier, he opened it in less than 20 seconds. The counting room was exactly as he'd seen it during his occasional supervised cleaning sessions. Rows of bill counters sat silent on tables, filing cabinets lined the walls, and in the back corner, behind a partition, the vault door stood open approximately 8 inches. Held by Hutchins' doorstop, Pierce could hear Hutchins in the break room, the distant sound of the coffee maker gurgling. He had perhaps 4 minutes before the supervisor returned. Moving with practiced efficiency, Pierce entered the vault. The cash was organized in clear plastic bins, sorted by denomination and rubber-banded into stacks of $10,000. Pierce had brought 2 large laundry bags, the kind used by the casino's linen service, items so common in the building that carrying them raised no suspicion. He filled both bags, working from the bins marked for transport to the Federal Reserve Bank later that week. These were bills that had already been counted and logged, waiting for pickup. Their absence would be noted immediately, but Pierce had accepted this reality. There was no way to steal $3.4 million without it being noticed. The question was whether he could disappear before they figured out who'd taken it. The bags filled quickly. Pierce had estimated he could carry approximately 60 pounds without appearing suspicious, and he grabbed exactly that amount based on months of weighing cash bundles on the scales in the counting room during his legitimate duties. He took mostly hundreds and fifties, leaving the smaller denominations because they took up more space. At 6:03 a.m., Pierce exited the vault the same way he'd entered, moving back through the storage room and into the service corridor. He could hear Hutchins returning, whistling tunelessly. Pierce descended the back stairwell to the basement level, where the laundry room operated 24 hours a day. The 2 overnight laundry attendants barely looked up as he passed through carrying the bags. They'd seen him transport linens dozens of times. Pierce exited through the loading dock at 6:18 a.m., placing the bags in his Honda Civic, which he deliberately parked in the employee lot's furthest corner under a broken security light he'd reported, but that hadn't been repaired. He returned to the building, disposed of his duplicate uniform in the industrial laundry, and clocked out at his regular time of 8:07 a.m. Gerald Hutchins discovered the theft at 6:32 a.m. when he completed his reports and went to secure the vault. He immediately noticed the disturbed cash bins and raised the alarm. Within minutes, Highland Park Casino had locked down. Police arrived by 7 a.m., followed shortly by FBI agents, as any casino theft over $100,000 automatically triggered federal involvement. The investigation moved quickly at first. Security footage was reviewed, showing nothing unusual in the main corridors. Hutchins was interrogated extensively, as was every employee who'd worked that night. Pierce was interviewed like everyone else, sitting calmly in the security office, while a Detroit police detective asked him about his movements. He told the truth about everything except the stolen uniform and the 4 minutes he'd spent in the vault. He'd been cleaning the third-floor offices between 5:30 and 6:30, he explained, an area with no security cameras due to privacy concerns about the casino owner's personal office. The investigation stalled. The FBI brought in forensic accountants who confirmed that $3.4 million was missing, all in large bills. They found no fingerprints in the vault beyond those of authorized personnel. The alarm system showed only the logged glitch in the storage room, which maintenance confirmed as a recurring problem with that particular sensor. Over the following weeks, agents investigated every employee with access to the second floor, conducting background checks and financial surveillance. Pierce knew they'd be watching him, so he did nothing. He continued working his shifts with perfect attendance. He paid his bills on time, but didn't pay off any debts early. He drove the same rusted Honda and lived in the same apartment. The money sat in the trunk of his car for 3 weeks. Then in a storage unit he'd rented using a false name in Pontiac, Michigan, where he'd paid cash for 6 months in advance. By June of 1993, the FBI had interviewed Pierce twice more but found nothing to connect him to the theft. His bank account showed only his regular paychecks. He had no unusual purchases, no suspicious contacts, no criminal history beyond a speeding ticket from 1989. He was, by every measure, exactly who he appeared to be, a 31-year-old maintenance worker living paycheck to paycheck in Detroit. But Pierce knew he couldn't stay at the casino. Too much attention, too many questions. In July of 1993, he quit his job, citing his mother's declining health as the reason. This was partially true. She had been diagnosed with diabetes, but mainly it gave him a legitimate excuse to leave Detroit without raising suspicion. That's when Darnell Pierce died. in a sense, and a new version of himself was born. Pierce had spent months planning his transformation before the heist. He understood that running would make him a suspect. Disappearing entirely would trigger manhunts, but becoming invisible by being utterly ordinary, that was the path no one would see. He'd studied how investigators thought, reading true crime books and articles about successful and failed heists. The ones who got caught were always the ones who ran or spent too obviously. The rare few who succeeded simply became no one. Flint, Michigan was 47 miles north of Detroit, close enough that relocating there seemed reasonable for someone with family obligations, but far enough that Pierce could slip between the cracks of different jurisdictions. The city was struggling even more than Detroit, its identity gutted by General Motors plant closures that had devastated the local economy. In Flint, no one asked too many questions. People came and went, chasing rumors of work or fleeing the collapse of neighborhoods. Pierce arrived in Flint in August of 1993 with a carefully constructed backstory. His mother had moved to Pontiac to live with her sister. He would explain if anyone asked. And he'd relocated to Flint because rent was cheaper, and he'd heard there might be work. He found an apartment in the Civic Park neighborhood, a rundown complex called Riverside Terrace, where the landlord accepted cash and didn't run credit checks. The apartment cost $280 per month and featured brown water stains on the ceiling and heating that barely functioned. The money remained in the Pontiac storage unit, untouched, except for the $20,000 Pierce had carefully extracted to finance his transformation. He knew he couldn't access the bulk of his fortune for years, possibly decades. Any significant withdrawal or spending would create ripples that investigators might detect, so he committed to living as a man with nothing, even while sitting on millions. In September of 1993, Pierce applied for a janitor position at Mott Community College on the west side of Flint. The college served approximately 12,000 students, mostly local residents trying to better their circumstances through education. The maintenance department was chronically understaffed, and Pierce's experience at the casino made him an ideal candidate. He was hired within a week, starting at $8.50 per hour with minimal benefits. His transformation was complete. Darnell Pierce, casino thief, became Darnell Pierce, community college janitor. Same name, same social security number, same person on paper, but stripped of anything that might draw attention. He deliberately gained 15 pounds by eating cheap, fattening food, changing his silhouette from the lean man in the casino employee photos. He grew a mustache and let his hair go grey naturally, not dyeing it like many men his age did. He developed a slight stoop to his posture, the physical manifestation of a man worn down by circumstance. The job at Mott Community College became his entire existence. He worked the day shift, 7 a.m. to 3:30 p.m., Monday through Friday. His responsibilities covered the entire eastern wing of the main academic building: classrooms, offices, bathrooms, and common areas. He mopped floors with mechanical precision, emptied trash cans, replaced paper towels and toilet paper, and cleaned whiteboards covered with equations and essays. Students barely saw him. To the 18-year-olds rushing between classes, Pierce was part of the building's furniture, as unremarkable as the beige walls or the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Faculty members might nod politely when passing in hallways, but none knew his name or anything about him beyond his function. His supervisor, a weary woman named Donna Pritchard, who managed the maintenance department, appreciated his reliability, but never socialized with him beyond necessary work communications. Pierce ate lunch alone in the maintenance break room, usually a peanut butter sandwich and an apple packed from home. He clocked out precisely at 3:30 each day and drove his aging Honda back to Riverside Terrace, where he'd sit in his apartment reading library books or watching a small television with rabbit ear antennas. He had no internet, no cable, no cell phone. His only telephone was a landline that rarely rang. On weekends, Pierce maintained his invisibility. He shopped at discount grocery stores, always paying cash, buying the cheapest versions of everything. He wore clothes from Salvation Army and Goodwill, not because he had to, but because a man in his supposed financial situation would. His apartment remained sparsely furnished. A second-hand couch, a rickety kitchen table, a mattress on a metal frame. The only items of any value were his books, paperbacks purchased for 50 cents each at used bookstores. But every 6 weeks, Pierce would break his routine in carefully controlled ways. He'd drive to Pontiac on a Saturday morning, taking a deliberately circuitous route that varied each time, and visit the storage unit. Inside Unit 127, surrounded by boxes he'd packed with old clothes and books to make the space look legitimately used, the 2 laundry bags from the Highland Park Casino sat wrapped in plastic tarps. Pierce would open one bag and remove $5,000 in $100 bills. He'd place these bills in a large book he'd hollowed out, a technique he'd learned from a crime novel. Then he'd reseal everything, lock the unit, and drive home. The process took less than 15 minutes, and he made sure to visit the storage facility at different times, never establishing a pattern. The $5,000 would go into a fireproof lockbox hidden in a false bottom he'd constructed in his bedroom closet. This money financed his carefully measured indulgences. Once every few months, Pierce would drive to a different city, Lansing, Grand Rapids, Ann Arbor, and stay in a mid-range hotel for a single night. He'd eat a good meal at a chain restaurant, nothing too expensive or memorable, and maybe see a movie. These trips were his release valve, brief moments when he could pretend to be a regular person with a regular life. But even during these escapes, he maintained discipline. He paid cash, used different hotels each time, and never did anything that might create a memorable impression. The psychological toll of this existence was immense. Pierce would lie awake at night in his barely heated apartment, listening to his neighbors argue through thin walls, knowing that millions of dollars sat less than 40 miles away, while he ate ramen noodles and wore shoes with cardboard inserts because the soles had holes. He'd pushed a mop around a college for years, while students complained about tuition costs that he could have paid for half the campus. The isolation was crushing. Pierce couldn't form real relationships because any true connection meant lying about his fundamental existence. He turned down invitations from co-workers for drinks or dinner, not because he was antisocial, but because every conversation was a minefield. Where are you from? What did you do before this? Do you have family? Each question required careful answers that matched his constructed history. In 1997, a maintenance worker named Gerald Moss started asking Pierce about his past. Moss was friendly, genuinely curious, and probably just making conversation during their lunch breaks. But Pierce felt the questions probing too close to truth, asking about Detroit, about whether Pierce had ever worked in casinos since Moss had a cousin in the industry. Pierce responded by becoming even more withdrawn, and eventually requested a schedule change so their shifts didn't overlap. There were close calls over the years, moments when Pierce's careful construction nearly collapsed. In November of 1999, a Flint police detective came to Mott Community College, investigating a string of burglaries in the area. The detective interviewed maintenance staff, asking about anyone suspicious they might have seen on campus. Pierce sat calmly while the detective looked at his identification and asked routine questions, his heart hammering so hard he was sure it was visible through his shirt. But the detective moved on, and Pierce realized he'd been worried over nothing. No one was looking for him anymore. The Highland Park casino theft had gone cold years ago. The FBI had indeed moved on. The case remained open but inactive, filed away with hundreds of other unsolved heists. The casino had recovered most of its losses through insurance, though the company had implemented dramatically improved security measures that became industry standard. Gerald Hutchins had retired in 1995, still haunted by the theft that happened on his watch. The investigating agents had pursued leads for 3 years, eventually developing a theory that the money had been taken by an organized crew with inside help. But they'd never found evidence to support this. They'd interviewed Pierce multiple times in the immediate aftermath, but cleared him when his financial records showed no suspicious activity. The FBI had watched his bank account for 18 months after the theft, seeing only his modest paychecks and routine expenses. By 1995, they'd stopped monitoring him entirely, As far as federal investigators knew, Darnell Pierce was just another working-class casualty of Detroit's economic decline, another janitor trying to survive. Pierce's discipline remained absolute through the years. He never made large purchases. He never paid off the storage unit more than 6 months in advance. He never bought a new car, even when his Honda's transmission started failing in 2001, instead paying cash for a used Ford Escort from a private seller in Bay City. The most extravagant thing he owned was a decent winter coat he'd purchased in 2003, and even that came from a department store clearance rack. The storage unit in Pontiac became his secret church, the place he visited to remember that his suffering had purpose. By 2006, he'd withdrawn approximately $600,000 from the total, spending it in tiny increments over 13 years. The remaining $2.8 million sat vacuum-sealed in the darkness, waiting for a future he'd imagined but could barely remember. Pierce had originally planned to wait 20 years before attempting to resurface with his fortune. He'd developed an elaborate scheme involving a fictional inheritance from a distant relative, complete with forged documents he'd been preparing for years. In 2013, when enough time had passed, and the statute of limitations on certain aspects of the crime had expired, he would move somewhere warm, somewhere the Highland Park Casino was ancient history, and live the life he'd denied himself. But fate and routine intersected on November 3, 2006, in a way that Pierce never anticipated. Donna Pritchard, the maintenance supervisor, had been receiving complaints from faculty about cleaning quality in the Eastern Wing classrooms. It wasn't anything major. Some trash cans not emptied, a few floors that seemed less thoroughly mopped than usual. Pritchard didn't suspect negligence, but she had to investigate. It was her job to conduct quarterly inspections of all equipment and supplies, and she'd been behind schedule due to staffing shortages. On that Friday morning, Pritchard went through the maintenance storage room systematically. She checked inventory, examined equipment, and noted anything needing repair or replacement. When she reached the closet Pierce used as his primary supply base, she found everything in order, chemicals properly stored, equipment clean and maintained. But there was one item that caught her attention. Pierce's primary mop bucket, a large commercial unit on wheels that he'd been using since he started at Mott, seemed unusually heavy even when empty. Pritchard had worked in maintenance for 23 years and knew what these buckets should weigh. This one felt wrong, bottom heavy in a way that didn't make sense. She tipped the bucket on its side and noticed something odd about the base. There appeared to be a seam where there shouldn't be one. A welded line that looked almost professional but not quite factory standard. Curious now, Pritchard examined it more closely and realized the bottom had been modified. Using a screwdriver from the supply shelf, she pried at the seam and felt it give slightly. Pritchard called Pierce on the internal phone system, asking him to come to the storage room to explain the modification. Pierce, who was cleaning a classroom on the 3rd floor, felt his blood turn to ice. In 13 years, no one had examined that mop bucket closely. It was just equipment, invisible as he was invisible. He'd grown complacent, assuming his hiding place was too obvious to ever be discovered. He walked to the storage room, knowing his life was about to end, at least the life he'd built. When he arrived, Pritchard was still examining the bucket, her expression more puzzled than suspicious. She asked him if he knew anything about the modification, if maybe a previous employee had done it for some reason. Pierce could have lied. He could have claimed ignorance and maybe talked his way through. But in that moment, standing in a maintenance closet at a community college, looking at his supervisor holding the bucket that contained $400,000 in its handle and millions more hidden beneath its false bottom, he felt 13 years of exhaustion crash over him. The loneliness, the isolation, the endless discipline of being no one, it all became suddenly unbearable. He told Donna Pritchard to call the police. She thought he was joking at first, or maybe having some kind of breakdown, but Pierce's expression was dead serious. He sat down on a stack of toilet paper packages and waited, while Pritchard, now frightened, stepped into the hallway and called campus security. Flint police arrived within 12 minutes. Officers separated Pierce and Pritchard, taking statements. When Pierce repeated his instruction to examine the mop bucket, one officer used a utility knife to carefully probe the false bottom. It came loose, revealing vacuum-sealed packages of currency that had been hidden there for over a decade. The officer's radio crackled with confused reports. More police arrived than supervisors. Within an hour, the maintenance storage room was a crime scene. The mop bucket was photographed extensively before investigators carefully removed the packets of $100 bills. The handle was unscrewed, revealing more cash packed inside the hollow aluminum tube. Pierce sat handcuffed in a campus security office while detectives tried to understand what they'd discovered. He provided minimal information at first, just his name, social security number, and a request for an attorney. But one detective, a veteran named Marcus Williams from the Flint Police Major Crimes Unit, noticed something odd. The bills were old, mostly from the early 1990s, and showed signs of having been stored carefully for a long time. Williams ran Pierce's information through state and federal databases, looking for outstanding warrants or previous arrests. Pierce's record was clean except for that old speeding ticket. But Williams, following a hunch, expanded his search to include unsolved crimes in Michigan from the 90s. He filtered for thefts over $1 million, a parameter that significantly narrowed the results. The Highland Park Casino heist appeared in the search results, a cold case from 1993 with $3.4 million stolen. Williams read the case file, noting the description of how the money had been taken: large bills, mostly hundreds and fifties. He looked at the currency now sitting in evidence bags in Flint and saw the same denominations. Williams contacted the FBI Detroit field office, speaking to Special Agent Rebecca Thornton, who'd worked the original Highland Park case as a junior agent. She'd since been promoted but still remembered the theft clearly. It had been one of her first major investigations, and the failure to solve it had bothered her for years. When Thornton heard about the discovery in Flint, she drove north immediately. By evening on November 3rd, she was sitting across from Darnell Pierce in an interrogation room at the Flint Police Department. Pierce had been read his rights and had an attorney present, a public defender named Michael Ross, who looked overwhelmed by the situation. Thornton laid out what they knew. The money was from the early 90s. Pierce had been working at Highland Park Casino when the theft occurred. He'd left Detroit shortly after and relocated to Flint. The math wasn't complicated. Pierce, after consulting with his attorney, confessed, not because he thought it would help him legally, but because staying silent seemed pointless. He was 54 years old. He'd spent 13 years living in poverty while sitting on millions. The game was over, and some part of him felt relieved. Over the next several days, Pierce provided details about the heist, walking investigators through his planning and execution. He drew diagrams of the Highland Park Casino's layout as it had existed in 1993. He explained the alarm system vulnerability, the timing windows, the bump key technique. Federal prosecutors listened with a mixture of frustration and grudging admiration at how simple the plan had been. Pierce then directed authorities to the storage unit in Pontiac. On November 7, 2006, FBI agents and local police executed a search warrant on Unit 127. Inside, among the boxes of clothes and books, they found the 2 laundry bags from the Highland Park Casino still wrapped in plastic tarps. The vacuum-sealed packets were intact, and when counted, the total came to $2.8 million. Combined with the $400,000 from the mop bucket and handle, authorities recovered $3.2 million of the original $3.4 million stolen. The missing $200,000 represented Pierce's careful withdrawals over 13 years, roughly $15,000 per year to supplement his janitor's salary and finance his occasional overnight escapes. The money was remarkably well preserved. Pierce's vacuum sealing had protected it from moisture and deterioration. Serial numbers were traced and confirmed as matching bills stolen from Highland Park Casino. The case that had been cold for 13 years was suddenly solved with mathematical certainty. Pierce's trial became a media sensation in Michigan. The story had everything: a sophisticated heist, a massive amount of money, and the bizarre twist of a thief hiding in plain sight as a janitor while pushing around millions in a mop bucket. Local news stations ran features about the mop bucket millionaire, a nickname that Pierce found grimly amusing. In April of 2007, Pierce pleaded guilty to federal theft charges related to the Highland Park casino heist. His attorney argued for leniency based on the fact that Pierce had essentially imprisoned himself for 13 years, living in poverty despite having access to millions. The prosecution, however, emphasized that Pierce had stolen from a business and defrauded insurance companies, causing significant financial harm. The judge sentenced Pierce to 18 years in federal prison, with credit for time served and possibility of parole after 12 years. Additionally, he was ordered to pay restitution of $3.4 million to cover the full amount stolen plus interest, though prosecutors acknowledged this was largely symbolic, given that Pierce's only assets were the recovered money. The Highland Park Casino had closed in 2002, a casualty of increased competition from newer, larger casinos in Detroit. The insurance company that had covered the theft received the recovered $3.2 million as partial restitution. The remaining $200,000 was considered lost to time in Pierce's living expenses. Donna Pritchard gave extensive interviews about the discovery, describing how she'd simply been doing her job when she noticed the modified mop bucket. She received a commendation from the FBI for her role in breaking the case, though she admitted to reporters that she felt strangely sad for Pierce. In 13 years of working with him, she'd found him to be a good employee who never caused problems, and she couldn't reconcile that person with the calculated thief who'd been wheeling stolen millions around the college. Students at Mott Community College were stunned to learn that the quiet janitor who'd cleaned their classrooms for over a decade was actually a millionaire living in self-imposed exile. Some found it darkly humorous that Pierce had mopped their floors while they complained about being broke college students, never knowing they were literally standing next to more money than most would see in a lifetime. The FBI's Rebecca Thornton, reflecting on the case years later, noted that Pierce's downfall came from the same meticulousness that had made his heist successful. He'd been so careful in planning the theft and his transformation that he'd created a life too perfect in its modesty, too disciplined in its routine. The irony was that if he'd been slightly less cautious, if he'd allowed himself more indulgences or spent the money more freely, he might have been caught sooner. Instead, he'd sentenced himself to 13 years of poverty that was, in many ways, harsher than prison. Gerald Hutchins, the Highland Park Casino supervisor whose coffee break had created the opportunity for the theft, died in 2005, never knowing the case had been solved. His family was informed of Pierce's capture and expressed relief that at least some closure had come. Even posthumously, Pierce himself adjusted to prison life with the same quiet discipline he'd brought to his years as a janitor. He became a model prisoner, working in the facility's maintenance department and keeping to himself. In a 2012 interview with a documentary filmmaker, Pierce was asked if he regretted the theft. He thought for a long moment before responding that he regretted the isolation more than the crime itself. The money had never brought him joy, only paranoia and loneliness. The case prompted Highland Park Casino's successor companies to implement even more stringent security measures in counting rooms across Michigan. The idea that a janitor could simply walk through an open vault door and take millions seemed absurdly simple in retrospect. But it had worked because Pierce understood that complex systems often fail at their most basic points. A propped door, a coffee break, a supervisor's routine. These mundane elements had created a $3.4 million vulnerability. The story of Darnell Pierce remains a cautionary tale about greed, isolation, and the impossibility of truly escaping consequences. He'd stolen millions and then condemned himself to poverty, creating a prison far more psychologically damaging than any federal facility. For 13 years, He'd lived next to a fortune while eating peanut butter sandwiches and wearing second-hand clothes, all while pushing that fortune through college hallways in a mop bucket that no one thought to examine. In the end, Pierce's carefully constructed invisibility became his cell. He'd succeeded in becoming no one, and discovered too late that being no one, even with millions of dollars hidden in your cleaning equipment, is perhaps the cruelest fate imaginable. The money was real, but the life it was supposed to buy never materialized. And when Donna Pritchard noticed that Mop Bucket was too heavy, 13 years of discipline, sacrifice, and isolation evaporated in an instant, leaving Pierce with nothing but regret and a prison sentence that seemed almost merciful compared to the isolation he'd imposed on himself. The money was recovered. The case was closed. But the question remains, was Darnell Pierce a brilliant criminal who almost got away with millions? Or was he a man who spent 13 years in a prison of his own making, only to trade it for a real one? Perhaps the answer is that he was both. A thief sophisticated enough to steal millions and disciplined enough to hide them, but not wise enough to understand that a life lived in hiding isn't really a life at all.